When Jacob Misiorowski debuted on June 12th, there was one statistic he produced that was the most eye-popping. And it wasn't the fact that he sits 99 miles per hour and touched over 100 miles per hour more than 10 times in that outing. It was the fact that if you look at his extension down the mound, so this point in space, he was releasing the ball 7.5 feet from the pitching rubber, the second highest mark in Major League Baseball. It seems like extension is an important pitching statistic, especially when you can take away a full foot for a hitter to make a swing decision or react to a pitch. But I think when we use this stat most often publicly, we miss a lot of the context that drives how a pitcher gets to their extension. And I'll be honest, after putting together this video, I've changed my mind on this stat. The main context I want to point out about extension is how connected it is to a pitcher's height. On average, a pitcher's extension is about 4% greater than their standing height. And the majority of our pitching population falls between 3% below their height in terms of extension to 11% above their height. If a pitcher is 6'3", we'd expect their extension to be about 6.5 feet. So if that same 6'3" pitcher is extending only 6.1 feet out to all the way towards 6.9 feet, this is all within about one standard deviation of our average. Now, this isn't saying there is not an advantage to being at 6.9 feet of extension as opposed to 6.1 feet. It's just saying it's not really rare if a guy's extending near that 7-foot mark at 6'3" on their standing height. And in speaking with some analysts for this video, one of the primary things mentioned about extension is that it really only starts to become material in terms of impact when you get to some of these more rare bounds of the trait. Misiorowski, for example, is pushing into that rare territory. His extension is more than 11% above his height. And if you want an even more rare extender, look no further than the White Sox Grant Taylor, who Brian Bannister called one of the best pitchers he's ever seen, who has one of the best breaking ball shapes we've probably ever seen, and who's only 6'3", but his release extension on his fastball is up at 7.4 feet from the rubber. Misiorowski is extending about 13% greater than his height, and Grant Taylor is actually up at 19% over his height. To put that in context, just 1.7% of pitches thrown by pitchers 6'3" or taller eclipsed 7.3 feet of extension last season. The next logical question is, okay, if I'm a pitcher, should I try everything in my power to extend beyond that 11% above my height to try to get into more rare territory? And this opens the Pandora's box of advantages and disadvantages around extension. The most intuitive advantage is the perceived velocity advantage. This is the idea that because of Misiorowski's extension, his ball has less time to slow down, so it effectively punches about a full mile per hour above its weight. One of the highest increases from a pitcher's normal fastball velocity to his perceived velocity in MLB this season. Despite this making intuitive sense, we don't usually find that large gaps between velocity and perceived velocity actually impact how good that four-seam fastball is. This is odd because I think one of the central ways that we perceive extension as helping is that it lowers a pitcher's release height the further you extend down the mound, which can help flatten out angles and make it hard for hitters through concepts like vertical approach angle and other things. So we have this weird flow of the aggregate data not really loving extension from a four-seam playability perspective, but the idea in the modern sense that that low angle ride concept is often one that piques teams' interests. And squaring those two matters is a bit difficult. I think what gets caught up in that perceived velocity point is just the raw velocity of the pitch, which is going to be one of the largest impacting factors on a pitch's success. From a downside standpoint, I had the thought that bigger extension relative to height meant less command, but this has been largely disproven as there's minimal relationship between height-adjusted extension and walk rate. Now, are there instances in a given pitcher where big extension can derail things? Absolutely. This, my friends, is why good coaches are so valuable, because they can likely ID when something that mostly has no signal in it from a macro level might actually be impacting a given pitcher. Tanner Scott is a great example of this. Tread Athletics has actually spoken about how the deep positions that he gets into tends to have an odd effect on the miss of his four-seam fastball. He'll occasionally pull it to his glove side down as opposed to naturally drifting it up away to his arm side like a lot of other pitchers do. Another potential downside of chasing extension that I learned from talking to a few individuals for this video is the idea that by extending further down the mound, you force yourself to become a bit more linear as a pitcher. And that sometimes can take away the horizontal features on a given pitcher's shape. So you can see how this might be an advantage for some guys and a disadvantage for others. This mostly lines up with what we see in pitch plots of guys who extend a lot down the mound. Think of Tyler Glasnow, Bailey Ober, Cade Smith, Jordan Romano, all pretty vertical pitchers overall, which you can see from their plots. There was also a blog post on Driveline Baseball where Kyle Bodie, co-founder of Driveline, cites a research paper that shows that an arm that is translated closer to home plate with respect to a pitcher's trunk actually has a negative correlation to velocity. This gets back to the point that a lot of extension adjustments are byproducts of things happening earlier in the chain. For example, lower half adjustments or different cues. They're not, as Kyle points out in this piece, a byproduct of guys trying to reach towards home at release or other kind of old school cues that can mostly be disproven with some basic reasoning and research. So we have some potential advantages of chasing extension, and we also have some potential disadvantages of chasing extension. But the thing I'll point out about everything that you're seeing on screen right now is that these are things that are very resultant at the point of release. And I think that is something that often gets us bogged down on the public side because of how much the data we look at is things that result from things happening earlier in the kinetic chain. Which leads us to the next point of context that I think is really important to emphasize around extension. Pitchers are just predisposed to move in different ways, and extension is really reflecting that movement. And perhaps this reflects how Major League Baseball organizations are thinking as well. In the minors, the average four-seam fastball extension is around 6.3 feet. And the top three teams in terms of overall extension on their fastballs are the Red Sox, Guardians, and Astros. If you've watched any Astros baseball this year, you might have thought about this point as well. Brandon Walter, Colton Gordon, and Ryan Gusto are all kind of big movers, big extension guys relative to their height, and they've done a really good job filling the gaps in an Astros staff that now has the lowest xFIP in MLB this season entering the weekend of July 4th. The Guardians have a bunch of big extension dudes as well, especially from the left side. Matt Wilkinson, Joey Cantillo, Parker Messick. Now, are the organizations like the Astros and the Guardians looking at these extension metrics and going, yes, I absolutely want that? No, but I think they're valuing something else in the throw, or perhaps more importantly, something within a pitcher's angles when they have that extension that's popping in their pitching models. The way I've started to think about extension is how it helps create angles at the plate. So it's taking that idea I mentioned earlier about extension, lowering the release height, and connecting that to how it influences the shapes a given pitcher creates and how those shapes play against a hitter. And my kind of shoddy reasoning here is that although when looking in the aggregate, extension might not pop out as an element that really leads you towards success, I think most teams are looking for edges within this data. And that edge is not something that I can quickly run as a basic correlation in Excel or something along those lines. It's probably something much more nuanced and layered. I think the best organizations in baseball do a really good job of understanding the broad elements of data, but also understanding where the limitations of that data are. And perhaps as we push out into these big extension guys, that's where we really run into odd angles, odd traits, or even the short extension guys. That's where we see the advantages on the edges of our curve here that teams maybe are trying to take an advantage of. Take, for example, the draft video I just did on some of the top college arms. There's a good example in there that shows the contrast between movement patterns on completely different ends of the spectrum. Kyson Witherspoon, a righty from Oklahoma, pretty explosive mover, short movement patterns. He sits 96, and he's 6'1" with 5.7 feet of extension, so lower than average. While Jamie Arnold from FSU is really good in deep positions, kind of like Tanner Scott. He sits more 94 miles per hour with 6.9 feet of extension at the same 6'1". This doesn't mean extension can't change, it's just that changes usually aren't that large. I'm pretty confident that Witherspoon is going to have below average extension, and Arnold is probably going to hang above average for most of their careers. Witherspoon will have steeper angles to the plate, Arnold is going to have flatter angles. So how does that inform the development track of a given pitcher? What are the limitations? Is there something else about the pitcher's throw or movement patterns that make you more or less confident in them as an arm? With Arnold, the concern is probably what happens as he ages and potentially tightens up. Can he hold strength at length in those deep movement patterns? With Kyson Witherspoon, I think it's more related to whether there's something in his body that's causing his arm to be a bit pushy, not sitting into that max external rotation as consistently, and does that limit his ability to create good lateral shapes? This is really how I use extension on the public side when I'm looking at a given pitcher. It allows me to kind of digest and becomes an element of their quote unquote fingerprint, which is a term I like using a lot because guys are subtly different despite the fact that they end up in similar archetypes most of the time. If you're making a hierarchy of pitching stats that aren't aggregated, so not like vertical approach angle or stuff plus, I think some combination of velocity and arm angle or release height are probably the most important. Extension is an added piece on top of all of that I think is really easy for us to understand, but it maybe doesn't have a ton of independent utility apart from the simple idea that more extension can help pull that release height down and can aid potentially in this concept of angles that we've talked about. Pitching is a very complex puzzle, one with a lot of variables that are very intertwined and hard to separate out and really find the true meaning of, partially because they all connect together, especially when you're talking about something like a release point that's very dependent on things happening earlier in a pitcher's chain. Maybe this is why velocity has become such a driving force in modern analytics and how important it is to certain organizations to throw hard in order to have success. It's probably one of the things that I don't think is as attached to everything around the release trait side of things. So I hope you learned something from this video. I will admit it was basically a way for me to try and combine all my thoughts on this concept of extension, because I feel like I've been hearing a lot about it, especially in the context of Jacob Misiorowski. So any questions, concerns, thoughts? As always, I'll see you in the comments. Thanks for watching.